All right, y'all, we are back from our lunch break. And so we're just going to pick up where we left off. This is the same guy who was speaking a moment ago. Yeah, let's get into it.
Yes. So the number of lands and groups would have been 6. I believe 1 was damaged, but I was able to see 5, and there was a space for an additional.
Okay. And is that consistent with the other projectiles we talked about earlier this morning?
It is.
What was the direction of twist?
It was a right-hand twist.
What was the bullet weight on that?
It weighed 174.8 grains.
Were you able to determine the material it was made of?
It was also composed of copper and lead.
What type of jacket was on that one?
I believe it was unknown as far as the type of jacketing, just because of the damage to the projectile. So it did have a jacket, it was copper jacketed, but I'm not sure exactly what type it was.
Okay, so you can't say full metal jacket.
Right.
And on the, was it magnetic?
No, it was not.
Were the lands and visible grooves measured?
Yes, they were.
And what was the approximate measurements of the lands and grooves?
It was very similar to the other ones. It was .078 to .081 inches for the lands, and the grooves measured to be approximately .115 inches.
Okay, now to speed this up a little bit, with regards to all the other items, 30.2, 30.3, 30.4, 30.5, 30.6, 30.7, and 30.8, did they all measure approximately the same caliber?
Yes, they did.
And what was that?
It was approximately 40 caliber, consistent with a 40 Smith & Wesson.
Okay. Did they all have the no more than 6 lands and groups?
Yes.
With regards to the direction of twist, could you measure that on each of them?
Yes, they were all right-hand twists.
The all, in terms of the cantilevers, this particular item, 30 and all sub-items, did they have any cantilevers?
No, none of those had cantilevers.
The bullet material as to each of them, what were they all?
They were all copper and lead.
With regards to, were they all magnetic or not?
They were all non-magnetic.
The rifling as to each of those, what type was it?
It was all conventional.
Were you able to determine a possible caliber on each of them?
So each of them were consistent with a 40 caliber projectiles, possibly 530, a 40 Smith & Wesson firearm.
Okay, so could you say that each of them were consistent with one another?
Yes, as far as class characteristics, they all lined up.
Were you able to give individual characteristics and tie them each together?
So for this set of projectiles, no. So I grouped them into two different groups.
Okay, why did you do 2 different groups?
So the first group that I grouped into had agreement of class characteristics, but because of the damage to the projectiles, I couldn't find agreement in any of the individual characteristics, and there was no disagreement in characteristics either. So for that one, it was just essentially, it could have come from the same firearm, or they could have been fired in the same firearm, and that's exhibits 30.4, 30.2, 30.3, 30.6, 30.7, and 30.8. So those could have been fired in the same firearm based on just overall agreement of the class characteristics.
And so it's clear and we're consistent in all of our numbering. 30.1, you already testified was G44.
Yes.
What was 30.2?
It was G57.
30.3?
It was G58.
30.4?
G59.
30.5?
G60.
30.6?
G61.
30.7?
G62.
30.8?
And G63.
Okay. The second group that you said you did involved which particular projectile?
So those were 30.4, 30.1, and 30.5.
Okay, so 30.4 is in both groups.
Yes.
How is that possible?
It's basically it was a representative that had the best detail to try to compare to all of the groups. So that's why that one's included in both of them, as both groups were compared to 30.4.
Okay. So with 30.4, 30.1, and 30.5, Were you able to draw any conclusions?
So the conclusion was still inconclusive, however, there was agreement of some individual characteristics. So for firearms examination, we have really 3 tiers of inconclusive results. There's inconclusive where only class characteristics are consistent, and that's essentially a 50-50, maybe they did, maybe they did not come from this gun. There are inconclusive results where there is agreement of class and some individual characteristics, which indicates that they were fired in this firearm, but there's not enough individual detail or not enough agreement of the individual detail to make that next step and say that they're an identification, so that they did all come from that firearm. And then the third category is that there's agreement of class characteristics, however, there is no agreement of any individual characteristics. And so that's basically indicating that even though the class characteristics might agree, it is likely not that firearm. There's just not enough difference to say for 100% that it's not that firearm.
Okay, does that conclude all of the evaluation you did with regards to projectiles in this case?
Yes.
Okay, moving on to cartridge casing. Were you provided some of those to analyze as well?
Yes, I was.
Okay, approaching and showing you what's been previously admitted into evidence as states 35 and states 23. Take a look at those. Do you recognize? So you first looked at states 35?
Yes,
Do you recognize that exhibit?
I do.
How do you recognize that exhibit?
Again, based on the my initials, employee ID number, as well as the date that I began and date that I finished the examinations, and my initials on the seal. And then the same thing for states 23.
Okay. So on these 2 exhibits, did you analyze the items contained within?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so if I may. So starting with what you have documented in your report as item number 4, G196.
Correct.
Did you analyze that cartridge casing?
I did.
And how do you analyze a cartridge casing as opposed to a projectile?
So similarly to projectiles, they do get assigned a worksheet that I add to each of the cartridge cases. Those worksheets are going to capture general information about the cartridge cases that will help the examiners determine whether or not there's any consistency in class characteristics across the cartridge cases that were submitted in the case. So the classes that we're looking for, the information categories that we're looking for are the caliber. We look at the composition, whether there's, the casings are brass and brass, or they're brass and nickel, or any combination of materials located on the cartridge cases. We notate the manufacturer, whether or not there's any presence of ejector marks, extractor marks. We also determine whether or not there's presence of a firing pin impression. Sometimes we are called to compare or examine live ammunition to determine whether or not it was cycled through a firearm. And so sometimes we examine things that don't have a firing pin impression at all because they weren't fired. We'll also document whether or not a particular exhibit was entered into NIBIN. So whenever we do entries into NIBIN, a representative will be entered. So not every cartridge case we receive is entered. It's a representative from the submitted case gets entered in. I'll also document any extra information that might be of value. So if I receive a cartridge case which has pieces of asphalt that are attached to it and maybe it was flattened on one end, I would document any of that information because it might let us know that casing was in the road and it was run over. Or if it's charred, it might have been burnt. And so that information, that if it seems like it may be pertinent, then I would document any of that information as well.
Okay, so if you could explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what is photo 2 depicting?
So the picture is a picture of exhibit number 6 on the left and exhibit number 5 on the right. And it's a comparison which was performed on January 18th. And then the microscope as well as magnification is documented there. And you can see the hairline is this line right here down the middle. So anything on this side is Exhibit 6, anything on this side is Exhibit 5. Then you can see the agreement starting up here with some of the grocery lines, and then all of this fine line agreement in that area as well.
So you just said that a word we haven't defined yet. The what lines?
Also, fine line striations is essentially what we would call them. So this particular firearm leaves parallel line striations on fire casings, which means that the breech face was manufactured with some kind of broaching tool, and it has parallel lines that are on that firearm itself. And so any casing that's fired through them should be expected to have similar characteristics. And then once you line them up, you can see that the directionality and everything lines up on these cartridge cases from left to right or right to left. And that's what that orientation and spacing between each of those lines is what makes it unique.
Okay. So going to Exhibit 4, that was the G196 on that. Did you analyze the caliber of that?
Yes.
And what was that?
It was 40 Smith & Wesson.
What was the case material made of?
It was a brass material, so the casing body was brass, and the primer itself was brass as well.
What was the manufacturer?
It was Blazer.
And just to, in the interest of expediency, on the exhibits, your exhibits 4 through 11, so G196 through G203, which are contained in states here, states 23. Was the caliber the same on each of those?
Yes, it was.
Was the material the same on each of those?
Yes, it was.
And does that go to the case and the primer?
Yes.
Was the manufacturer the same?
Yes, they were all Blazers.
What is looking for sealant?
So sealant is something that manufacturers can apply to this area in between the head stamp and the primer. They apply it, it's essentially a lacquer that gets applied to try to prevent any moisture from getting into the cartridge cases. Sometimes that lacquer can persist through firing, and sometimes it doesn't. So what happens in the firing process is after the firing pin strikes the primer, this whole pocket will actually be expelled out of the cartridge case and into the firearm by the pressure inside of the cartridge. And then the cartridge reseats itself through the cycling process. So if there was a sealant around that, it can be pushed out during the firing process. But sometimes, so there's certain manufacturers which have a characteristic sealant, so like Cellular and Below is an example of one that puts a very thick red colored lacquer on its sealant. And so if we observed it, we would document it was observed. But the absence doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't one there, it's just it wasn't there when it was submitted to the lab.
Did you document sealant on any of these 8 casings?
I don't believe there was sealant present on any of them. Sure.
And can you just refresh your recollection, please?
So there was no sealant present on any of them.
In terms of the extractor marks, were you able to document those on each of these exhibits?
Yes, I was.
Were they consistent from 4 through 11?
Yes, they were.
What about the ejector marks?
I believe there were ejector marks. Yes, so there were observable ejector marks on all of the cartridge cases.
And were they consistent with one another on items 4 through 11, your items?
Yes, they were.
And that's again G196 through G203.
Correct.
The weathering or anything on these cartridges, is that something you document?
If it was something that was extremely weathered, yes. So if an abnormal presence of rust, or if there was some kind of debris, whether it's dirt, grass, or something, would be documented, yes.
Did you document that in this case?
I didn't observe it.
In terms of the DNA or MVAC procedure, are you involved in the processing of the casings at that point?
No, I'm not.
In the timeline, do you get the casings before or after the MVAC is done?
Theoretically, I would get them before. So ideally, they would get to me before. Sometimes, and I suppose it's through the process of investigation, they believe they have enough DNA or they think they have DNA from a certain source, and if it doesn't pan out, they may need to come back and process the cartridge cases. So it's not unusual for them to come back and after I've handled casings to then go ahead and process the casings.
Oh. So what do you do to ensure that your DNA doesn't wind up on casings?
So I try to use gloves as much as possible, but we're not a clean unit. So almost inevitably, if I handle them, my DNA would end up on the cartridges.
And you can explain what you mean by a clean unit.
So clean in the sense that our protocols are essentially for safety for handling firearms. We're not really looking for biological contaminants from case to case. So we don't clean our workspaces every time we work a case, right? That's a requirement for our DNA units. Anytime they're going to work a case and they start a new one, they have to clean up everything in between. So bleach and wipe down of their entire work area every time they have a new case. In our unit, we have a lot of tools that we use. We have a lot of different mechanisms that we end up using, brass tracks. We shoot into a shoot board. And those items, while clean, are not clean with bleach every time we work a case.
They're not sterile.
Correct, they're not sterile.
So in terms of the DNA process, is it the best practice to do that before it gets to you?
Yes, that's the best practice.
Continuing back on through items 4 through 11, G186 to G203, did you have a conclusion as to each of those particular exhibits?
Yes, so each of those cartridge cases were found to have been fired in one 40 Smith & Wesson firearm. So there was only one firearm which fired all of those cases.
And so that is again G186 to G203, 4 through 11.
Correct.
Was there any things that were different between those in numbers 4 through 11?
There may have been minute differences, but there was enough agreement of individual characteristics that made it obvious that they were fired from the same firearm.
So moving on to states 35. You evaluated this particular item of evidence?
Yes.
And it's got your initials and sticker up at the top?
Yes, it is.
Okay, what is in your exhibit 12?
It's another 40 Smith & Wesson caliber Blazer cartridge case.
Was this evaluated on the same date and time as state 23?
Yes, it was.
What steps did you take to make sure that what is your exhibit 12 did not get switched with any of the other evidence, the other 8?
So the cartridge cases again will be labeled with permanent marker or a electric scribe with the information from the case, specifically having that it is exhibit, in this particular case, exhibit 12 versus the other exhibits.
And because they're packaged in different packaging,
Mhm.
does that tell you anything about your processing?
For us, it doesn't really change how we're going to process it. So whether we do have different agencies which submit things very differently. Some agencies will actually submit every cartridge case in a separate package. So whenever we receive the packaging, it doesn't really change how we're going to analyze the evidence, because the question ultimately is still the same question: is this 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge case, could it have come from the same firearm which produced the other 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge cases?
Okay. So the G number here on what is in evidence is states 35. How did you document that?
It's a G138.
And were you present at the Miramar Substation 2811 Southwest 186th Avenue when it was recovered on October 26th of 2018?
No, it was not.
Going on to exhibit number 12. I want to go through that. Were you able to determine what caliber exhibit number 12 was?
It was 40 Smith & Wesson.
What was the case material and primer material?
They were both brass,
What was the manufacturer?
Blazer.
Was there sealant documented?
No.
Were there extractor marks?
Yes.
Were there ejector marks?
Yes.
Was there a firing pin shape?
Yes,
What was the firing pin shape on Exhibit 12?
it was hemispherical.
And is that documented in what is photo 2 in the USB drive?
Yes, so this is the firing pin impression on this side, and that circular shape is the hemispherical shape that I was referring to.
When, Mr. Bello, when you're given these pieces of evidence, are you told which one is important? Are you told which one is a value or anything like that?
Sometimes they give us some information. It's typically in the form of a CL-15 or a crime lab submission form. Luckily or unluckily, I guess however you would like to look at it, for firearms, that information really doesn't matter to us because the ultimate question for us is still the same. So it doesn't matter really for us where this exhibits were collected, where they came from, who they believe they're affiliated with. For us, what really matters is, can I objectively say that these items came from one source or did they come from different sources? So that's really the question that we're always trying to answer.
Okay. So we've talked about the hemispherical firing pin shape. Was Exhibit 12, G138, magnetic?
No, it was not.
Okay. In terms of, did you come to a conclusion as to whether or not Exhibit 12 was consistent with the casings of your Exhibits 4 through 11?
Yes, it was.
How so?
So Exhibit 12 shared all of the same class characteristics as the remaining cartridge cases that were submitted in the case. And upon further examination and comparison on the microscope, it had sufficient agreement of individual characteristics to tie it to the same firearm, which produced the other cartridge cases in the case.
Can you say that the projectiles that were recovered came from any specific casing?
No, I can't say that.
And in terms of the list of, and you mentioned going on to photo 3 here, what are we looking at in this photo?
So this is the entry or the images of the entry into NIBIN. So these are the images that would eventually get searched by the NIBIN database. The first image is the overall image of the head stamp, so it includes the information, the manufacturer, caliber, and the primer detail that's there. The other pictures, so the first image doesn't typically get compared or correlated. It's the more detailed pictures that are underneath that do get compared and get a correlation score, so score of agreement. And then they're just different lighting images. They're all the same types of images, they're all just different lighting. So the top left image is a 2D black and white image. This image is what they call a 6 o'clock grayscale image. This is a firing pin image, and then this is the all in focus image. And when I'm looking at these on the computer screen, typically I'm looking at one of these images, so not all of them. This is just how it prints out in the system. And then the bottom 2 images are just 2 different lightings of the ejector mark. So that's this little area there is the ejector mark, and that's I believe this is the 3 o'clock lighting, and this is the 6 o'clock lighting.
When you say 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock lighting, what do you mean?
It's the directionality of the light from within the actual system. So the system itself is pretty much automated. So once I insert the casing and put the relevant case information, I just click acquire, and then it begins to acquire all of these images on its own. So it automatically focuses, it'll automatically place these different rings. So like this is a red ring here, this has a blue ring on the edges. So it automatically places all of that information in there, and those are the different details that will ultimately be correlated by the system itself.
And in terms of any associations or anything like that, were you notified of any associations?
No, so no associations were made in this particular case.
And is that updated on a regular basis?
Yes, so if any association were made after, which can happen if a firearm comes in at a later date and gets testified and put in, it can link to this particular case. Up until now, that hasn't happened.
Okay. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Ma'am. Counsel, you may proceed. Mr. Bello, at the conclusion of your testimony, I think you should hand out certificates. Fundamental identification dealing with firearms. That's number one. So you've got a lot of certificates to hand out. Fair enough? Okay. You examined these projectiles and casings on 2 different dates, correct?
Correct.
One was on, I think your report was 1/11,
Correct.
and the other one was on 3/3 of 22.
Correct.
1/11 of 2019, and then 3/3 of 2022.
Correct.
Could you tell us, beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt after all of this examination, how many firearms created these casings and projectiles?
So what I can say is that one firearm fired the casings, so one firearm produced the cartridge cases that were submitted. And as far as the projectiles are concerned, I can say that 2 of them came from one firearm, and then the other ones could have come from the same firearm, but I cannot conclusively say that there was only.
Okay, so there could be more than one firearm that created all of these items, correct?
As far as the projectiles, yes.
Okay. Fair enough. Now, after you did all of this analysis, were you able to determine what gun was used to create these projectiles and casings?
No, in the absence of a firearm, I cannot conclusively say it was one or the other.
Have you heard the term trajectory reconstruction?
Yes.
What is that?
So that's typically an examination that's done using either rods, some people use lasers to match points on a line that would designate the trajectory of a projectile that was traveling.
And that would be able to place, supposedly, if you can do it, where the shooter or shooters were when they fired the firearms.
Certainly, at least the firearm. Okay, it would be the muzzle of the firearm is technically the origin point. Yes.
And that would be in someone's hand,
Somebody's
correct?
Right.
Let me see that. What we're talking about is being able to tell where the muzzle was, so you in essence would be able to tell where the shooter.
Correct.
I just wanted to play.
No problem.
Okay. When you do a trajectory reconstruction and you're attempting to find out where the gun is and where the so-called shooter or shooters were, are there certain variables that come into play?
Certainly, there's a lot of variables that come into play.
Why don't you tell us what some of the variables are?
So some of the variables that come into play is whether or not there were intervening objects. So do you have a beginning and an end point? Do you have a middle point? Right. So if I only have, as an example, a hole in the wall, but I don't have anything else, I don't have somewhere I could put a rod through, or that I could start the directionality of a laser from. Right. So without that, I'm basically dead in the water because I can start it from any point in this room. Because let's say there's a bullet hole in that exit sign back there, and that's the only hole that I have. It'd be very difficult for me to be able to place where the person originated from. Now, if an object is, let's say, 3-dimensional, not 2-dimensional, and the bullet travels through that object, then you can pass the rod through and then find a directionality. There's still variables with that. How far away were they? How close were they? And so that's kind of, it gives you a line, but the point upon the line that the firearm was is the question.
How about may I approach, I'm sorry.
Yes.
How the person held the gun.
Sure.
There's a thing called holding it tight.
Mm-hmm.
That could affect how you position the shooter or shooters, correct?
Sure.
If he holds it upside down or sideways,
The origin point should technically still be the same,
okay.
technically speaking.
Okay. How about, we said tight, how about if he holds it very loose?
If you limp wrist, as we would call it,
What's that term?
limp wristing.
You're way above me. limpless.
Yeah, so normally when you're firing a firearm, you want to try to cradle the weight of the firearm, and that's usually in your wrist. Limp wristing is just you're letting your wrist kind of rock with the firearm. And so while the origin point may be similar, the trajectory of the projectile leaving the barrel may be different.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
How about the weather conditions?
So as far as trajectory is concerned, it can play a role over significant distance. So whether, I'm sure most of us have heard or seen stories of people making sniper shots at a mile or a quarter mile or 3/4 of a mile. When you're shooting at distances like that, you have to take into account weather, wind. You actually have to take into account the rotation of the earth. So the people who can shoot out at that distance are exceptionally rare. But to be accurate at those distances, you have to be able to mitigate for gravity, wind, and for the spinning of the earth. So those are factors that can play a role in significant distance. If we're talking about a distance of 2 feet or 3 feet, then the weather is going to play a much less significant role.
How about the object that the projectile hits?
Yes, I can certainly.
Like glass?
Right, so whether it's glass and the type of glass plays a role. Is it impact glass? Is it tempered glass? Is it standard glass? So all of these things can play a role. Is it a thicker pane of glass? Is it bulletproof glass? Is it soundproof glass? So I mean, there's a lot of different variabilities. And then obviously the thickness of that glass plays a role. The thicker the glass is, the more likely that the projectile is going to be significantly damaged and change its flight after it leaves that glass. Also, the angle of impact where it hits the glass can change after it travels through. But you might have a projectile that's traveling straight at glass, and then after it passes through the projectile, through the glass, it can travel downward, it can travel upwards. It all depends on the angles of the glass and the angle that the projectile was approaching the glass at.
How about the grain weight of the ammunition?
So of the projectile itself.
Yeah.
So that can play a role because obviously the heavier an object is, with the force being applied to it, the more likely it is to stay in its directed path. That's kind of going back to that sniper scenario. That's why most snipers are using very large calibers. They are more likely to stay in flight longer and be less subjected to these changes than lighter, smaller projectiles.
And if the shooting occurred inside a car, for instance, would the arm length matter of the so-called shooter or shooters,
It could.
and whether or not the person was leaning in one direction?
Sure, hey, we're working in a very small environment.
Okay, so there's a lot of variables that one must take into consideration
Yes.
before you say where the gun was or where the shooter or shooters were when they fired this firearm.
Right.
And if you don't take those variables into consideration, you're just giving a guesstimate, estimate of where everybody was, correct?
I assume so. I mean, I'd have to see the situation, but yes.
And you would consider that to be not proof beyond to the
Objection, Your Honor.
As a manager of the Broward Sheriff's Office tool and what's the title, tool and,
Fireman tool work unit.
okay. You certainly would want to take all those variables in before you told this jury or any jury.
Yes, scientifically, I would want to make sure that I'm accounting for as many variables as possible whenever rendering an opinion.
Otherwise, it would be just a guess, an
Yes.
estimate, right?
Right, I want to give a scientifically valid opinion.
Fair enough. Could I have 1 moment, please?
Yes.
Thank you very much. No further questions.
I think that's okay. Counsel, thank you. Demonstrate, redirect to this witness.
Briefly, Your Honor. Mr. Bell, counsel asked you about arm length and if it matters. Does arm length have any effect on the ability of someone to pull a trigger?
No,
Can the trigger be pulled with an arm fully extended?
yes,
Can it be pulled with it next to a person's body?
yes.
Is there anything that would prevent a trigger from being pulled in any orientation?
No, so the firearms are designed so that the firearm itself is an autonomous form. So the only thing that's required is for this trigger to be pulled, and whether it's upside down, sideways, any which way, apart from something blocking it, it will function. So something has to be impeding the function of the firearm for it to function.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Counsel, is this witness excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Hold on.
Yes.
Thank you. You may step down, sir.
Thank you.
You're excused. Thank you.
Thank you.
Counsel, who's your next witness?
State calls James Morano.
Good afternoon. You are James Morano.
Yes, sir.
Welcome. This is our witness stand over here. When you get there, if you just remain standing for a bit, and you put the things down. Remain standing, raise your right hand and be sworn.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you shall give in this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please state your full legal name for the record.
James Morano,
Please spell your first and last name for the court.
Jambs Marano.
Thank you, sir.
Please have a seat. Morano, that microphone in front of you, adjust up or down, but does not move back and forth.
Thank you.
Are you ready to proceed?
Yes.
Counsel, you may.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you introduce yourself to the members of the jury and tell them where you're employed?
My name is James Morano. I'm a senior crime laboratory analyst with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in Orlando, Florida.
And how long have you been employed by the, we'll call it FDLE, Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
20 years.
Okay. And in what capacities during those 20 years?
I've been a crime laboratory analyst in the trace material section in the Orlando laboratory.
And can you tell us your official title?
Senior crime laboratory analyst.
And can you briefly describe the nature of your work?
In the trace material section, we're tasked with recovering, recognizing, examining, and comparing items of trace materials or trace evidence. These are typically things like glass and paint, things that are broken during the commission of a crime or some incident, and they're submitted to our laboratory from police departments and sheriff's offices, and we're asked to compare them and to write a report about our findings.
So law enforcement agencies within the state of Florida can make submissions to the FDLE.
Yes.
Specifically, like, can you tell us about your specialization in glass? How long have you done that?
I completed the glass training program within FDLE in 2008, and I've been working in cases in both paint and glass for about 14, almost 15 years.
Okay. And can you tell us about your formal education?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Forensic Science from the University of New Haven in West Haven, Connecticut. I was able to double major during that time, so I also have a Bachelor of Science in Biology, and I graduated in 2002.
And as part of your training and certification that's required by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, can you tell us about some of those trainings?
Yes, so when I moved to Florida in 2003 and I entered the paint training program within FDLE, that's a 2-year training program. It's very comprehensive. It's broken up into 2 phases. There's an academic phase that includes lectures and practical exercises as well as tests, oral, written, and practical tests. After completing that, I did some casework in paint, and then I entered the glass training program, and I did a similar training program within glass. It's about a 1.5-year long training program. After I completed that, I was able to do independent casework in both of those material types.
And are there any continuing requirements that you currently hold or that you do throughout the time you've been employed by FDLE to keep up to date in your field?
Yeah, we try to do continuing education as frequently as possible. I've attended many seminars, workshops, virtual workshops the last several years. But I've taken some week-long training courses, either in trace evidence generally, in forensic science, or specifically with regard to paint, glass, testifying in court, statistics, things like that, anything related to trace evidence.
And are you a member of any professional organizations or any associations within your field?
Yes, I'm a member of the American Society of Trace Evidence Examiners, known as ASCE.
And how about your certification within FDLE? What are you certified as?
So FDLE certifies me to work independent casework in both paint, it includes polymers, so it's paint polymers as well as glass.
How much of your time would you say is devoted to glass analysis?
Typically it would be 50% of my time, but the last few years it's been more. I've been involved in almost exclusively anything having to do with glass in the laboratory. I have a trainee that I just got out of training, so I trained him the last several years. I am responsible for the instrumentation that is used to analyze glass. So I have to maintain it, I have to validate it if we get an instrument to make sure that it's working properly. I write the standard operating procedures and the work instructions for those instruments, as well as anything else related to glass. And I've been working all the glass work for FDLE for several years.
So you're doing both an administrative role as well as a forensic role?
Yeah, I would say that, sure.
Approximately how many samples of glass evidence have you examined during your career?
Hundreds, several hundreds, I would say.
Okay, and does that include casework?
Yeah, I would say training and casework. I've looked at several hundreds of glass samples in the last 14 years.
How about your prior testimony in court? Have you previously testified as an expert in the area of trace evidence or trace materials?
Yes, I've testified 14 times in 9 different counties in the state of Florida.
And 14 times since what year?
I didn't have the opportunity to testify until 2012, so in the last 11 years, I've testified about 14 times. And
as far as proficiency training, is that continuing and ongoing during your time?
You're referring to proficiency testing?
Proficiency testing.
Yes. Every year we do have to take a proficiency test in the sub-disciplines that you work. So I have to take a test in paint and a test in glass every year. And I have to get the right answer to continue doing that work.
And are you currently up to date?
Yes.
And in this specific case, were you asked to examine items of glass evidence?
Yes, I was.
And I'm going to refer you to FDLE number 2019-05-02577. Is that a unique number that is assigned by FDLE?
Yes, that's the unique case number.
And when cases come in, they're assigned with FDLE unique number, correct?
Yes.
Is that how you track the evidence in the case?
Yes.
And where's the evidence is coming from other departments, correct?
Yes.
And what did you receive for examination in this particular case?
In this case, I received 8 items of evidence. They were numbered by FDLE, items 1 through 8.
And were they previously numbered by the department that sent them to you?
Yes.
Do you recall the department?
It was the Miramar Police Department.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
I'm going to approach, get the exhibits. What's already in evidence is states 42. Can you take a look at that? And do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
And how is it that you recognize it?
I see the FDLE case number, the item numbers, and my initials in my handwriting.
So you're able to identify it based on the packaging as well?
Yes, the packaging and my initials are on the seal that I resealed.
Okay, and I'm gonna show you states, what's already in evidence is states 22. Do you also recognize that item?
Yes, I do.
And how is it that you recognize it?
In the same way, the FDA case number, item numbers, and my initials are on the packaging as well as on the seals.
And are those, what item numbers, would those equate to your FDA item numbers?
These are item numbers 1 through 5.
Okay, and in states 42, those are item numbers,
These are item numbers 6, 7, and 8.
I'm gonna show you what's been pre-marked for identification purposes only as states ZZ. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
And how is it that you recognize it?
Also by my initials, the case number, the item number in my handwriting, and my initials on the seals.
And do these exhibits collectively represent what you were provided with for the analysis in this case?
Yes, it does.
Any changes, or is it in the same, substantially same condition as you last saw it?
These are in the same condition as I last saw it, yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move into evidence what was pre-marked to say ZZ as the next numbered exhibit.
Is there any objection?
No.
It'll be admitted.
State ZZ will be marked states 50.
Mr. Moran, I'm gonna leave things with you. There's some gloves there, and here's scissors.
As yeah, it is. I'm having bad weather here, and so my service is terrible. My internet went out for a while. So let's see. Let's pick back up where we left off. I'll take it back a little bit. All right.
I'm going to approach, get some exhibits. What's already in evidence is states 42. Can you take a look at that? And do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
And how is it that you recognize it?
I see the FDLE case number, the item numbers, and my initials in my handwriting.
So you're able to identify it based on the packaging as well.
Yes, the packaging and my initials are on the seal that I resealed.
Okay, and I'm going to show you states, what's already in evidence is states 22. Do you also recognize that item?
Yes, I do.
And how is it that you recognize it?
In the same way, the FDLE case number, item numbers, and my initials are on the packaging as well as on the seals.
And are those, what item numbers, would those equate to your FDLE item numbers?
These are item numbers 1 through 5.
Okay, and in states 42, those are item numbers,
These are item numbers 6, 7, and 8.
okay, and I'm going to show you what's been pre-marked for identification purposes only as states ZZ. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
And how is it that you recognize it?
Also by my initials, the case number, the item number in my handwriting, and my initials on the seals.
And do these exhibits collectively represent what you were provided with for the analysis in this case?
Yes, it does.
Any changes, or is it in the same, substantially same condition as you last saw it?
These are in the same condition as I last saw it, yes.
All right, at this time, the state would move into evidence what was pre-marked to say ZZ as the next numbered exhibit.
Is there an objection?
No.
It'll be admitted.
States ZZ will be marked states 50.
Mr. Moran, I'm going to leave things with you. There's some gloves there, and a pair of scissors. All right, so let's go through the 5 question items labeled under FDLE as 1 through 5. What do you reference those samples as?
So these are represented as being found at the scene. The scene was described as US 27. So all 5 items were found in one scene.
Okay, and states number, I believe 20, is that states number 22 or 42? If I may, sure, John?
Yes, ma'am.
This is
Yes.
22.
22, so let's refer to states 42. What are those samples from?
These are represented as being class standards from a vehicle, from a Jeep Compass. It was described as being standard from the front passenger window, the rear passenger window, and then a sample from the rear window.
And what are you tasked with when you're provided with these items?
My job is to open up the evidence, inventory what's there, describe what's there, and then compare the 2 samples. And typically the question is, there's question samples found someplace, and the agency wants to know, is it like another sample? Is it like a sample from the window, broken window? Basically asking, could it come from that window?
So it's essentially a hypothesis, right? Are items 1 through 5 compared or of the same nature as items 6 through 8?
Yes, I'm looking to see if they're like one another.
Okay. So when you get those items, what is it that after you've documented the items and everything like that, what are you doing next?
After I document them and take inventory by taking notes and pictures, then I actually start the comparison part. And I'm doing a side-by-side comparison. So I'm looking to see, I'm actually looking for differences. Can I see any differences between these 2 samples? So I'm looking at the color, the thickness of the samples. Can I see what type of glass it is? Is it window glass or is it container glass, like glass from a bottle? Generally speaking, that's what I'm doing first. And if I don't find any differences, then as I progress through the examination, I'm doing more detailed comparisons using microscopes and instrumentation.
All right, I'm gonna stop you there. So that analysis that you just discussed, is that your macro analysis?
Yeah, macroscopic is a fancy way of saying with the naked eye, yeah.
So essentially, you're doing an overview.
Yes.
And what is your next method or your next step?
The next step would be a microscopic examination. I use a low-powered microscope at my workstation, and I'd be comparing the samples side by side, looking for microscopic features that would tell me what kind of glass it is, or if there's any differences between them.
And can you describe in detail what you're doing as far as the microscopic approach? Like, how are you looking at each glass and which samples?
In this case, these fragments were rather large, so I didn't really need to use the microscope as much as I do in other types of cases. But for instance, I'm looking at the fractured characteristics, so I'll take the fragments and look at the side of it, and that would instruct me what kind of glass it is, as opposed to, is it tempered or not tempered glass, things like that, kind of generally what type of glass is it.
And is there further analysis as you go through? That would be your microscopic stage. Is there further analysis?
The next, after the microscopic, yes, there would be instrumental examinations where I'm using an instrument or a machine to provide data about the sample. So one of those tells me chemical information about the glass, so I can see what the chemical composition of the glasses are. And another one is called the refractive index. And I can measure the refractive index of both samples and compare those values that I get.
Outside of the microscopic analysis stage, are you using any other equipment during the, for instance, chemical composition review stage or the refractive index stage?
I use a micrometer to measure the thickness of the fragments to see if they're the same thickness. And I also use an ultraviolet lamp looking at the surface of the glass. If one surface fluoresces or glows brightly, then that tells me how that glass was manufactured. If it does do that, then I could say that it's consistent with float glass, meaning it was made using the float glass process. And that's just to kind of tell me what kind of glass it is. Yeah.
Okay, so you kind of explained the general broad overview. Can you give us a little background into what makes glass even unique and how does it apply to your discipline, right?
If I can explain how glass is made, it might assist the jury.
Would that be in your testimony?
Yes.
Yeah.
So float glass is the most common manufacturing process to make window glass. Essentially, you have raw materials, which are minerals like sand, soda ash, and lime, that are mined from the earth and they're melted down in a furnace. And that molten mixture is poured over a tin bath. So it's molten tin, and the glass floats on top of it. That's why it's called float glass. The difference in density allows that to happen. And what that allows the manufacturer to do is to slowly pull that ribbon of glass over the surface of that tin. They can control the thickness of it, and you also get extremely smooth, flat surfaces. So that's why modern window glass looks flawless. You can see through it, there's no defects in it typically. So that tin actually leaches into the glass, and that's why I can see that tin or float surface when I use the ultraviolet lamp. Thank you, I appreciate that. Thank you. Excuse me, thanks.
So is glass unique between manufacturers?
It's hard to say. I like to speak more in terms of plants, right? So glass is made in a big manufacturing plant. There's probably over 200 float glass plants globally. So there's many plants making glass 24/7 all the time. So from plant to plant, there's going to be differences because they get the raw materials from locally sourced areas. The manufacturing process itself will change the composition of the glass. For instance, that furnace that I talked about where they melt everything, it's made of bricks, zirconium bricks. That zirconium can break down over time and get into the glass. So you'll see levels of zirconium increase and decrease over time from one plant. So I can't say that the glass came from a specific plant because that plant's going to change the end product over time. So there's a lot of variation in glass from plant to plant and within one plant over time.
So essentially, for instance, Toyota, they have an assembly line of plant that they're creating or manufacturing glass for their vehicles. Within that manufacturing plant, there's going to be differentiations within the glass that's manufactured in that one plant.
I would agree, except I don't know if Toyota makes their own glass. They would get their glass from a manufacturer and then put it on their vehicles. And there's no rhyme or reason as to where they're getting their glass from. They can get their glass from one plant 1 year, and then next year they can get their glass from somewhere else. And they can change mid-year if they have to, depending on supply issues.
All right, so let's talk about the evidence that you were provided with. And if Your Honor, maybe the witness step down to assist in the
Yes.
evidence. You can bring the packaging, we're
Yeah.
able to view it for, and the scissors. Yes. And we'll start with the known samples. If you can go ahead and open that up.
Where should I do that?
We can do it right here. If you put it under the light. So if you put it under the green light, the jury can see.
So this is my handwriting, item 6, item 7, and item 8.
And are you able to open the glass, so open the container so we can see the glass particles?
I can.
Do you need the scissors?
Just gonna do one at a time so I don't
Yep.
have any incidences. Using them. So this is item 6. Yes, this was item 6 that was just opened.
And in your macro analysis, can you explain to us what you're looking at?
Yes. So that little plastic dish is what the samples I actually took out of this tin to use in my analysis. I did look at everything. So when I'm taking inventory, I'm in the sense of looking for glass that doesn't belong. I'm looking for different populations of glass, different types of glass. And if they all look the same, then I consider that they're all the same type of glass. So I would do that with the naked eye, and if I have any question, I could use a microscope to look in that pile of glass and see if there's anything that doesn't belong or is not like these other ones. I was looking at the color, the type of glass that it is, and if I had to, I can look at the thickness of them to measure that.
Okay, and as far as item 5 or 6, 7, and 8, they were very similar in nature? Or from a known,
So,
how would you characterize it?
So item 6 was the one that's represented as being from the front passenger window. That one is light blue green in color. Once I open up 7 and 8, you'll see that they're actually dark gray in color. So there are 2 types of glass present in these standards.
Okay. Let me just adjust this for a second. Sorry.
This one is item 7. And again, this is the plastic Petri dish that I put in there to separate out glass that I examined in further detail. This was the glass that was submitted to me. As you can see, it's dark gray in color, so it's different from the item 6 glass.
Okay,
And this was represented as being from the rear passenger window.
and when you're ready, we'll look at item number 8.
So again, item 8, this is the plastic petri dish that I put in here. This was all the glass that was submitted, and this represented the rear window of the vehicle. And again, you can see it's dark gray in color. So it's different from item 6, which was light blue-green in color.
Okay. And you're taking samples you notated in that petri dish. Why are you taking the samples and not, for instance, utilizing all the glass?
So I would say that my examination does include all of the glass. I'm looking at all of them when I open it up, and I'm taking that inventory, I'm taking pictures and taking notes of what I see, and then I separate out some for further analysis, for detailed analysis. So I don't have to go back into the tin every single time. I could portion out some of this glass since I'm considering them all to be like one another. Visually, I'll take some out, and that's what I'm using for further examination.
It's like when you did a science test in class, you took the petri dish and you put a sample of what you were using from, right?
Yes.
I'll give you a chance to put those back in and then we'll swap out.
Do they need to be resealed?
Not at this time.
Put them back inside.
Yep.
All right, and these are items 1 through 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
And with respect to items 1 through 5, are you aware of the origin when you receive these glass samples?
No, I'm only told that they were found at a scene, that they're questioned in nature.
Okay. So for instance, you don't know that it comes from a side window glass, correct?
No.
Okay. And so you can go ahead and open up each sample.
So this is item 1. And like before, there's a petri dish from my analysis where I separated out. These are the samples that were actually analyzed in detail, but I did examine all of the glass in this tin. I looked at it with the naked eye and with a microscope just to take inventory and describe them.
Okay.
And these are all light blue-green in color. So this is item 2. Here's the plastic dish that I put in here. So these are the 5 fragments, 5 or 6 fragments that I separated out and I analyzed in detail. But I did look at everything in this tin, and you can see that these are dark gray in color. They're different from item 1, which was the light blue-green in color.
Let me adjust this a little because it's tempered.
So at this time, when I opened up each of these, I made note that there were 2 populations of glass present. There was a light blue-green population and the dark gray population. So I knew that there were 2 types of glass found at the scene, at least 2.
And why is the color significant?
Because it's a discriminating characteristic. It allows me to distinguish different glasses. Item 3. Once again, the plastic dish with the sample of glass that I separated out. And there are numerous light blue-green fragments in this item. This is item 4. Sure. Item 4. Again, the plastic container that I made and numerous fragments of light blue-green glass. I will add in this item, I noted that there was, I don't know if you can see it, but there was a bright green fragment.
If you wait a moment for it to adjust it.
So this fragment right here, that's kind of by itself, that one is actually a different color than the rest. It's bright green. When I analyzed it further, I saw characteristics that were consistent with container glass, so I could tell it did not come from a window. It probably came from a bottle or a container. The last one is item 5. Again, the plastic container. And there's some apparent plant material with glass fragments in this tin. In this one, there was one, you can kind of see it stands out, that one bright green fragment right here. It's different from the other one, so it's not like the light blue-green glass, it's bright green in color, and it also had characteristics consistent with container glass. So I can say that that one did not come from a window.
And as far as what's in evidence now, it states 50. Did you originally receive it separately packaged?
No, I made this package.
And why is that?
There were fragments in items 1 and 3, which is glass from the scene, that appeared to have a reddish brown residue on them. So I thought that might be significant, so I repackaged them separately and I preserved them so they can go back to the original agency. If they wanted to pursue further examinations, they can. So I did no further examinations with these glass fragments.
So you took a sample from 1 and 3 and you itemized it as 1.1.
Yes.
Okay. That.
I'm going to open it.
All right, you can take your seat. Okay, ultimately, you were able to, after your analysis, go through and make your own opinion as to the origin of this subject glass or the unknown glass. Is that correct?
Yes, I compared, so that, like I said, there were 2 populations of glass, so I compared the light blue-green glass from the scene to the light blue-green glass standards from the vehicle. Standard, there's one standard. And then I compared the dark green glass from the scene, item 2, to the the dark gray glass in item 2 to the dark gray standards from the vehicle, which are items 7 and 8.
And so what was your ultimate opinion as to the origin of the glass?
So I found no differences between them. So my ultimate conclusion is that the 2 populations of glass from the scene, the light blue-green glass and the dark gray glass, were like the standards from the G-Compass, meaning they either came from that vehicle or they came from another source of glass having the same exact characteristics. That means it would have to have the same color, the same thickness, the same refractive index, as well as the same chemical composition. In my professional opinion, I find that latter possibility of it coming from another source somewhat unlikely.
Okay, and you mentioned the uniqueness of each thing. So for instance, that the glass that's in evidence as states 22 and 42, you said they have the same complete or the same thickness. Why is that significant in your analysis?
Because it can be a discriminating characteristic. If glasses differ by a certain amount, we have a criteria that we follow. If they differ by a certain amount, then I can say that they couldn't have come from the same window if they're different thicknesses.
And what type of glass is in states 22 and 42?
So all the glass that I described is what I call tempered float sheet glass. Tempered means that it's that cubed diced glass that you see when a side window of a vehicle breaks. It's considered safety glass, so those small pieces won't cut you if the vehicle gets to an accident or if the window's broken. Tempered glass is found at your home too. Maybe your shower door or sliding glass door may have tempered glass. As opposed to non-tempered glass, which is going to break into sharp, pointy shards that could cut you. So I can tell that just by its appearance and some of its microscopic features that's the kind of glass it is. It's tempered glass. By float, I mean it was made using the float process. So when I use that ultraviolet lamp, one surface fluoresced brightly, which is an indication of the surface that was in contact with that tin bath. So some of that tin leached into that surface. It fluoresces, glows brightly under the UV lamp, so I can call it float glass. The last descriptor is that it's sheet glass, which just means that it's window glass. I can tell that the surfaces are flat, they're smooth, those fragments are not from a bottle or a container or tableware, they're from a window or a door or some other type of flat glass.
And the tempered float sheet window glass is consistent with what manufacturers would use to place on vehicles, as opposed, like you said, to glassware that you may have in your house.
Correct. Almost all side windows and rear windows are going to be made out of tempered float sheet glass.
And as specifically pointed out, I think it was item number 4 and item number 5, that there were some small fragments of bright green glass that you were able to separate as another origin of glass.
Yes, there's one fragment in each.
Okay, and you were able to determine and separate those fragments, 1 in each, 4 and 5, from the other sample, correct? Contained within those samples.
Yes, they were different from the glass in those tins. So in item 4 and in item 5, they were different. They were also different from the glass standards. So they could not have come from the vehicle windows. They're a different color and they're a different type of glass.
And just to clarify, because I'm going to be clear. So for instance, item number 4, you have your own sample that you pulled out. That sample was the tempered float sheet window glass that you're saying is consistent with vehicle glass, correct?
Yes,
However, the small fragment, the bright green glass, was from a different origin, meaning it could have come from a container or another source.
correct.
And same for item number 5. Your sample was consistent with the tempered float sheet glass that comes from vehicle glass window. But the one small fragment, that was the light, the bright green glass, was from a different source.
Correct.
And as far as the dark gray glass in item number 7 and 8, what was the, why is that glass dark green, for lack of a better term, versus the other glass, which we see as a light green or bluish characteristic?
Typically, modern vehicle manufacturers make the rear passenger windows and the rear window dark gray, which is a natural tinting so you don't have to put an aftermarket tint on it. It just tints the passenger part of the vehicle.
So you're able to distinguish that dark gray as coming from the rear of the vehicle as opposed to the light, the other colored glass coming from, for instance, a passenger side.
Correct. Usually the front passenger windows are going to be blue-green-ish in color, and then the rear ones will be dark gray, especially in modern vehicles. It's very common now.
And also, as to items number 6, 7, and 8, you indicated, well, let me ask you about the edges of the glass. Was there anything significant in the edges of those glass?
I'm not sure what you mean.
So for instance, the rounded finished edges.
Yes. One of the, I'm not sure which exhibit, but one of the exhibits had a rounded finished edge, which is consistent with what you would see in a side window. So if you lower your side window and you feel the top of it, it's smooth, it's rounded. That still doesn't cut you. So we see that in casework. It's an indication of where it came from.
You said you didn't recall. Would your report refresh your recollection
Yeah,
as to where that was
yes.
found? if you have a moment to refresh your recollection and look up when you've reviewed.
So yes, those glass in items 6 and 7 that have the rounded finished edges, and those were the 2 samples from the side windows of the vehicle.
And how about you indicate, well, we haven't defined it yet, but what is frit? Can you explain to the jury what frit is?
Frit is the black opaque border you'll see in like windshields and also on rear windows. It serves a couple of purposes. The main one on a windshield is it gives the installer a place to apply the adhesive, so it sticks to the window stays in place. You'll see it on the rear window as well. It creates just a natural boundary for the glass, so it's not so stark visually. You'll also see frit in the side windows. If you ever see the little numbers and codes on side window glass, sometimes it even says who made that glass. That's going to be in frit. Frit is a ceramic coating basically that put on screen printed onto the glass, and it's fused to the glass. It's almost impossible to scrape off. So it's part of the glass. If I see frit in casework on 2 different samples, I can compare that frit as well as the glass.
And were you able to identify frit in any of the samples that you were provided with?
Yes, some of the standards had frit, the black frit on it.
Can you identify which item numbers? And if you need to refresh your recollection by reviewing the report.
Thank you, I'm sorry. Item 6 had some numbers in frit on one surface, and there was frit on some fragments in item 8 as well.
And that was an indication, was that also an indication to you that this was coming from a vehicle as opposed to another source of glass? The presence of frit?
Yes.
How about item, specific as to item number 8, defroster? What is the significance of that?
The rear windows on vehicles have that defrost capability, and it's basically a metal wire that runs the surface of the glass. Occasionally I see that in casework. So if I do see that, it's an indication that that is a rear window glass source. And item 8 in this case did have a defroster wire or a metal coating that was consistent with defroster wire on one surface. And the item 8 was from a rear window.
Okay, and you mentioned in your opinion regarding the fact that it's your opinion that the latter possibility is considered unlikely. How are you able to narrow down the probability of that second hypothesis?
There's a couple of things that factor into that. One is the fact that I'm using discriminating techniques that distinguish glasses from one another, different sources of glass. Like I said, I'm looking for differences. So if I find a difference, then I can say that these 2 samples are not like one another and it could not have come from that source. So when I don't find a difference, then I can say that they're like one another. The question is, it either came from this source of the standards, the vehicle, or from another source. That other source would have to have the same exact characteristics. So in this case, you'd have to have a source of 2 types of glass, light blue, green, and dark gray in color, that were broken. They have to be broken to be deposited at the scene, and it would have to be at that scene. So the pool of potential sources that exist is limited. Not every vehicle is going to have glass like the glass in this case. Not every Jeep may have glass like the glass in this case. Like I said, over time, glass can change from one plant, and glass will vary from plant to plant. While it is possible that another source deposited glass at the scene, and it was exactly like the glass in this case, I find it somewhat unlikely just based on those factors.
Okay. The fact that it would have to be another vehicle with broken glass, so it wouldn't be every Jeep on the road, correct?
Correct, it would have to be broken.
A moment to confer your own? Nothing further.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a short recess.
We have no questions.
No questions.
No questions.
All right, so is this witness excused?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, you can step down, sir. You're excused, ladies and gentlemen, for our recess now. Do not discuss the case, don't form any opinion about the case. Don't allow anyone to discuss the case. Return to church, their research, and do protest under chair. Thank you.
I apologize for interrupting the court.
Thank you. Let the record reflect the jury stepped out. Counselor Manuel was defendant. Anything to discuss, counsel?
Nothing here.
You need a restroom break, Mr. Dennis?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we arrange for that for Mr. Dennis, please.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Your recess.
Your next witness is.
Nope.
Yeah, we'll go through the photos.
Garrett. Yeah, right there.
All right, guys, they are taking a recess. I'm not sure how long they'll be gone, but I do have some stuff that I need to take care of. So I'm gonna hop off and then we will jump back on when they return.